These are the most disturbing crimes that happen in the chess community, and with each case, the stories just get darker and darker. It's November 20th, 1990, and one of Russia's most notorious serial killers, Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Rostov Ripper, is arrested by Soviet authorities. He would later confess to 56 murders, all of which were women and children, and his crimes would horrify the nation. Meanwhile, in Moscow, a 16-year-old boy sees the news, but instead of being alarmed, he finds Andrei pretty inspiring actually, and so he decides that one day he's going to end even more lives than the man he now idolizes. That boy is Alexander Pishushkin, and what he was planning would make Andrei look like an amateur. Alexander was born on April 9, 1974, in Mytishi, a suburb of Moscow, Russia. His father left when he was just over a year old, and his mother, Natalia Elmuradovna, raised him with the help of his maternal grandfather, who we will call Albert. Natalia later remarried, and Alexander grew up with a stepfather and half-sister. For the first few years of his life, Alexander seemed like any normal kid. He behaved well, loved animals, and showed no signs of any abnormal behavior, up until 1978. That year, at just 4 years old, Alexander was playing on a swing when he accidentally went too high, lost his grip, and fell backwards. And before he could get up, the swing came back and struck him in the forehead, making him fall right back. Now, the injury looked minor at the time, but as medical experts would later say, the impact was severe enough to damage his frontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls how you handle your emotions and make your decisions. And so after that injury, Alexander became aggressive and started pulling away from people. He even started mixing up certain sounds when he spoke. For example, he'd swap the S and sh sound when he spoke, almost like a lisp. And when he started going to school, his classmates noticed this immediately. They called him an R-word, and they bullied him whenever they got the chance. Alexander, who had no idea why any of this was happening, became timid. He felt unwanted at school and kept to himself at home. His mother, Natalia, soon noticed how withdrawn Alexander had become and found out that he was being bullied at school for having the lisp, so she enrolled him in a speech therapy boarding school for children with similar difficulties, hoping he would make friends there and overcome his lisp. And while Alexander was soon able to catch up to his academic level, he was still treated as a social outcast because of his behavioral issues and aggressive nature, as he would often get into violent fights with his classmates, and his mental health just kept getting worse. Albert was the only friend Alexander had, and he was the only person he called and cried to every bad day. Albert listened every time and wanted nothing more than to get his grandson out of that school, but Natalia wouldn't allow it. So Alexander stayed, and his resentment towards society just kept growing over time. Eventually, when Alexander became a teenager, Albert could no longer bear to hear his complaints, and so, despite Natalia's protests, he pulled him out of the school and brought him to live with him at his home in Moscow. There, Albert actually enrolled him in a nearby public school and encouraged him to try sports and other hobbies. Now, at first, Alexander was shy, but eventually he took Albert's advice and started going to the school gym. Now, soon after, he developed a love for fitness and started working out daily, hoping that getting ripped would stop the bullying, but unfortunately, it didn't work, and so Albert tried something else. In an attempt to cheer Alexander up, he decided to teach him how to play chess. One day, he took Alexander to the Bysevsky Park, also called Bitsa Park, where they would play chess with other older men who frequently visited the park. Now, Alexander was a natural, and he quickly started winning matches against Albert and his new older buddies. And in no time, Alexander became happier. He also started joining Albert and the other men for vodka after their matches. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. But little did his older buddies know that befriending Alexander would be the worst mistake of their lives.
They come here almost every day, seeking refuge from city noise and nagging wives and indulging in their lifelong passion. But what seems like a safe haven is in fact a crime scene, and these old men might be just pawns in the maniac's hands.
Things were going well for Alexander for the first time in his life, until 2 years later in 1989, when not long after Alexander's 15th birthday, Albert actually died. The loss shattered Alexander, and he fell into depression and started drinking heavily. Although the park was still there, Albert wasn't, and without Albert, it was just trees and strangers. And so he stopped going too. He then moved back to Natalia's home, where his drinking habits and depression only continued to get worse. But as time went on, Alexander slowly began to recover. To overcome his depression, he started going to the park again to play chess, and his workouts finally paid off as the other kids at his school began to take notice. As a result, the bullying stopped at school, and girls started leaving love letters for him. And when Natalia actually found some of those love letters, she asked Alexander who they were from and if he had a girlfriend, but he made it clear that he wasn't interested in dating anyone at the time. What he didn't tell Natalia though was that he secretly already had feelings for someone else, and those feelings were soon about to get reciprocated. Now, getting the attention of girls wasn't all that changed for Alexander. He even made his first real friend, a boy from the neighborhood named Mikhail Odichuk. Mikhail was an easygoing dude and thought Alexander was pretty harmless. He liked to joke around with him and was the kind of person who made things feel lighter. Especially for Alexander, Alexander in the years since Albert died. And around this time, Alexander also got his first job as a shelf stacker at a local supermarket. But deep inside, Alexander wanted to have power over other people, and soon he found a way to have just that by lending the money he earned to his classmates. For teenagers who feared embarrassment over unpaid lunch or other minor debts, his offer felt like a convenient lifeline, and so they took it. But when his classmates didn't repay him on time, Alexander didn't just ask for his money back. Instead, he threatened them. He slipped notes into their lockers, written as if they were from the borrowers themselves, claiming that they had taken their own lives for one reason or another. Then he would warn them to pay up or he would kill them, and it would be ruled as them leaving the earth on their own once the notes in their lockers are discovered by the authorities. Now this terrified his classmates, but he didn't care. This time he wasn't the one being bullied, and to him that was all that mattered. And so he continued tormenting and bullying them, and he made sure to film every moment as well, as he loved to rewatch these old tapes to reaffirm that he had power over others. On one of these occasions, he held a young child upside down from a window and said calmly, "You're in my power now. I'm going to drop you from the window and you will fall 50 meters to your death," which is approximately 49 feet. He recorded the child scream and plead for his life, and this would soon become his favorite tape to rewatch. Then on November 20th, 1990, about a year after Albert's death, Andre's arrest aired on every news channel, and 16-year-old Alexander stopped being interested in small cruelties. He studied the coverage obsessively. He learned everything there was to know about Andre and his victims by collecting newspaper clippings, while he even began dressing like Andre himself. And soon after, he began planning to be better than his newfound role model. He told his friend Mikhail that he wanted to surpass Andre's death toll, and had fantasies about killing at least 64 people, one for each square of a chessboard. But upon hearing that, Mikhail simply laughed. He thought Alexander was joking. But little did Mikhail know that Alexander was already eyeing his first victim. And so 2 years later, on July 27th, 1992, Alexander and Mikhail, who were both 18 at the time, went to Pizza Park. But by nightfall, only Alexander returned home. When Mikhail was reported missing the following day, the police suspected Alexander because he was the last person to be seen with him. Now Alexander was brought in and interrogated for 3 days. But he told the police that he and Mikhail had gone their separate ways that day after leaving the park. And with no body and no evidence pointing towards Alexander, they let him go. But earlier that evening, Alexander had actually asked Mikhail to help him kill a man they saw at the park. But when Mikhail refused to take part in the plan, Alexander decided to switch victims and strangle his friend instead and dump his body in the sewers. Mikhail's body was never found, and for Alexander, this was only the beginning. That same year, in 1992, Alexander finally began dating his childhood crush, a girl in his neighborhood called Olga. Olga had lived nearby for years. She was warm and direct, the kind of person who said what she meant and meant what she said. Alexander had watched her from a distance for a long time before he ever worked up the nerve to say anything, and she was actually the reason Alexander wasn't interested in dating any of the girls who were leaving love letters for him at school. So when he finally got the chance to date her, he was the happiest man in Moscow, and things seemed to be good between the two lovebirds. In fact, they were almost inseparable. When Alexander wasn't playing chess, he was with Olga, and for the first time since Albert's death, something mattered to Alexander more than chess. But a few months into the relationship, everything changed. They began fighting more, and eventually Olga broke up with him. Alexander was sad and heartbroken, and he vowed to fix the relationship, and so he kept trying over and over again, but it was all useless. And then he started hearing rumors that Olga was actually now dating one of his other closest friends, Sergey. Sergey was one of the few people Alexander was close to, especially after Mikhail's mysterious disappearance. Sergey knew Alexander loved Olga, and he knew that he'd been trying to get her back. He lived around the neighborhood too, and always hung out with Alexander at the park, where they talked and played like regular teenagers would. But the rumors could have been lies, and so Alexander needed to confirm for himself if his friend had betrayed him. So Alexander decided to confront Sergey. However, the next day, Sergey would be found dead after having fallen from a window, and a note was soon discovered in his locker saying that he left this earth on his own, and so the authorities ruled it as that. No one suspected that Sergey had been pushed, or that the note was placed in his locker by Alexander. And not long after that, Olga mysteriously vanished as well, and her body would never be found either. Now for the next couple of years, everything went quiet, and Alexander lived a normal life. He worked a stable job, owned a dog, drank, and played chess at Pizza Park with the older men, the way he and Albert used to. His neighbors even thought of him as quiet, harmless, and good with animals. But that changed 4 years later, in 1996, when Russia suspended the death penalty, and upon hearing this, Alexander once again found himself fantasizing about taking lives. But he would continue living normally for around 5 years, until May 17, 2001, after his dog died. That day, 27-year-old Alexander went to Pizza Park as usual, but not only to play chess this time. There he saw an older man named Yevgeny Pronin sitting all by himself. Alexander approached him and struck up a conversation before the two started playing chess, and he soon learned that Yevgeny was homeless, which was exactly what Alexander was hoping to hear. Alexander told Yevgeny that he was sad because his dog had recently died, and asked Yevgeny if he'd like to accompany him to his dog's grave in the deeper part of the park in exchange for some vodka and cigarettes, and Yevgeny agreed. And once Alexander had lured Jevgeny into the deeper part of Pizza Park, he sat down next to his dog's grave, where he gave Jevgeny a bottle of vodka and some cigarettes, and the man made a toast to the dog. But that wasn't his dog's real grave at all, and Alexander was actually patiently waiting for him to get drunk enough before completing the last step of his plan, taking Jevgeny near the sewers, striking him at the back of his head with the empty vodka bottle, and pushing him down to his death, which is exactly what Alexander did next. Now Jevgeny was just the first of 36 people Alexander would kill in the same exact way within the next 4 years. Almost all of them were, just like Jevgeny, elderly homeless men whom Alexander would ask to join him as he went to visit his dog's grave, where he would get them drunk on cheap vodka before knocking them out with a bottle or a hammer and dumping them down the sewers. But Alexander still wasn't happy, because no one had noticed the disappearances and no one was afraid. There was no killer in the headlines or a citywide panic. To Alexander, who'd spent his entire childhood wanting to be seen, the invisibility felt like an insult. And so in 2005, Alexander took a more horrific approach. This time he took his victims to the park and attacked them from behind with a hammer, without even getting them drunk sometimes. And afterward, he would push a bottle of golden magic vodka into their open skull, all while filming the entire act. And then he wouldn't even dump the bodies down the sewers, and instead just leave them there out in the open. But just as his method changed, so did his targets, because this time Alexander almost exclusively targeted people he knew from his childhood neighborhood, including the older men who he previously used to hang out with when Albert was still around. And so on November 16, 2005, Alexander invited a guy named Nikolai Zaharchenka for a walk. Nikolai was 63 years old and lived a few doors down from Alexander, and the two of them had known one another for quite some time now. So when he got the invite, he showed up and they drank together. And afterwards, Alexander took him for a walk deeper in the park, where he split Nikolai's skull open with a hammer and pushed a bottle of vodka inside. And just like his other recent victims, instead of pushing Nikolai's body into the sewer, Alexander left it out in the open. Later on, the body was found and the report spread, and now Moscow was finally terrified. And what Alexander didn't know was that Nikolai wasn't just another old man from his neighborhood, but a former police officer, and therefore the police became more alarmed, as they believed it was a direct attack on them. And so for the first time, police were actively hunting a killer. But despite searching for days, they found nothing that led them back to Alexander, and so he continued his killing spree, killing at least 10 more people the same year. Then, on the 13th of June 2006, Alexander made his first real mistake. On that day, he invited a 36-year-old co-worker of his, Marina Moskolyova, to a date at the park. Marina was a mother who worked at the same store as Alexander. She liked him, and the two had become friends. And so before leaving home that day, Marina had left a note for her son, telling him that she was going out to meet Alexander, and she also left his phone number on the note. Now, her metro ticket had also confirmed that she'd entered the Moscow metro system, where surveillance footage had shown her being accompanied by Alexander. Until now, Alexander had carefully chosen victims whose disappearances rarely gained attention. However, this time, the trail he had left led straight to her. And so when Marina's body was found the following day, on June 14, with the skull split open, investigators of course immediately arrested Alexander, but nothing could have prepared the police for what they were about to find. Back at the station, Alexander sat down smiling, fully aware that he finally had the attention he always wanted, and so he proudly confessed to Marina's murder. He told the investigators that he knew that Marina had left that note for her son, and he knew that he'll be caught this time, but he went ahead and did it anyway, saying,
"It was kind of a leaving this earth on my own. I just couldn't go on. I was severely depressed at the time."
Not only did he admit he killed Marina, but he also confessed to killing 61 other people in total, revealing to the police where he dumped each body and how he had filmed their deaths.
И сам серийный убийца, на счету которого 48 человеческих жизней, Александр Печушкин. Это он на месте убийства своей последней жертвы.
Вот и все, собственно.
Police found a chessboard. 62 of the 64 squares were filled with dates corresponding to these murders. And that's how Alexander earned the nickname that the media would soon call him by, the chessboard killer. The investigators also learned that Alexander had never actually planned to stop at 64 murders. Rather, he'd intended to fill all 100 squares of an international chessboard with murder dates. Then, for the first time, authorities heard what actually happened at Pizza Park in 1992. They found out that Alexander had killed his friend, Mikhail, and pushed his body down the sewer. They also learned that Alexander had pushed Sergei down the window, and also that he was responsible for Olga's disappearance. Alexander described his criminal career as a perpetual orgasm. He described how killing Mikhail felt like a first love, recalling how it had felt like
Butterflies in his stomach.
and was
Almost magical.
He said that killing neighbors and friends made it more savory for him.
The closer a person is to you and the better you know them, the more pleasurable it is to kill them.
He explained. To Alexander, he was God when he murdered, and had claimed that
In all cases, I killed for only one reason. I killed in order to live. because when you kill, you want to live. For me, life without murder is like life without food for you. I felt like the father of all these people, since it was me who opened the door for them to another world.
But then the investigators told him something that left him devastated. 3 of his victims had actually survived. In 2002, Maria Viricheva, a 4-month pregnant woman, was attacked by Alexander and was bludgeoned and thrown down a well. But she actually survived the attack and climbed out of it. And speaking of the incident,
Когда он взял меня за волосы и стал бить об этот круг железный, я поняла, что если я не опущу руки и не упаду в него сама, он меня убьет.
Maria recalled how she'd almost died. She said she mustered every ounce of strength she had and fought to survive for her baby.
Я была не в силах выбраться оттуда. Я стояла всю ночь по пояс в этой ледяной воде. Мне было плохо, больно. Мне было страшно, я не знаю, мне было холодно в конце концов. Мне было до такой степени больно, что я не хотела жить на тот момент. Просто я думала, вот зависело бы что-то от меня, я бы сейчас что-нибудь с собой сделала, чтобы не...
But sadly, her baby didn't actually make it. However, when Maria reported this attack to the police, it was actually dismissed, and she was threatened with deportation because she was an illegal immigrant. But that same year in 2002, a young boy, who we will refer to by his last name, Lobov, was pushed into a well. His jacket had caught a piece of metal sticking out the wall, saving him from falling into the freezing water. Lobov too reported the attack to the police, but rather than investigate his claims, the police threatened to arrest him, thinking his story was too crazy to be true. But days later, Lobov actually confronted Alexander at a metro station, threatening to tell everyone about the incident, but Alexander simply ignored him because he felt that no one would actually believe him. The third survivor was Konstantin Polikarpov. Alexander invited him for a drink at Pizza Park on November 15, 2003, and walked him into the deeper ends of Pizza Park. He then bludgeoned him with a hammer 3 times before throwing him into a well as well. Thinking he died, Alexander left, but Konstantin luckily survived, but was left permanently disabled. These 3 survivors pushed Alexander's confirmed kill count from 62 down to 59, and 11 out of the 59 remained unproven by prosecutors, so he was now down to 48. On October 24, 2007, Alexander was convicted of the 48 murders and the 3 attempted murders and was sentenced to life at the Polar Owl Arctic Penal Colony, a facility reserved for serial killers and Russia's most dangerous inmates, with the first 15 years in solitary confinement. At Alexander's trial, he sat in a transparent cage and said nothing. He showed no remorse and no fear, and when the judge asked if he understood the sentence, he snapped, yelling,
"I am not deaf."
Now almost 2 years later in prison, Alexander reportedly said,
"For 500 days I've been under arrest, and for all this time you have all decided my fate. At one time I alone decided the fate of 60 people. I alone was the judge, the prosecutor, and the executioner. I was God. I alone fulfilled all of your functions."
He also revealed that he had another reason for killing all these people, saying,
"I tried to collect their spirits, their souls. I felt no emotion when I killed them."
He then boasted that they should not credit the police for catching him. He praised himself, saying,
"I gave myself up. In my case, repentance is not just unnecessary, it is wrongful."
Alexander then told other inmates that if he ever got out, he would take the lives of 2 people for fun and force himself on a woman. He said that he had no regrets for what he did. In his words,
"Do I regret it? No, I don't. Almost all the guards admire me. They are banned from communicating with me, asking me questions. I hear they talk among themselves. They say about me, he's the real deal."
But that was not the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was that in prison, Alexander continued to receive dozens of love letters from women who claimed to love him, although he doesn't seem interested in them, and has even written to one lady in particular, telling her to go see a psychologist. He also told her that he had someone in his life, a 29-year-old Siberian children's store saleswoman in Nigan named Natalia. He claimed he was in love and wanted to marry her. Natalia also has a tattoo of him on her body, and in her letters, she fondly calls him a pet name, Sasha. She claims to love Alexander more than life itself, and according to her,
it has never crossed her mind to part with him.
However, authorities eventually stopped any contact between them. Now, Alexander used chess to track his kills, but the next man used it to escape justice, and nearly tricked an entire federation in the process.
The same year that Claude Bloodgood became the 2nd highest chess-rated player while serving life in prison, reaching a peak rating of 2,789 USCF.
This next one is about a man named Klaus Bluegood, who was also known as Claude Bloodgood. Claude was a chess lover born in Norfolk, Virginia on July 14, 1937, to German immigrants, Fritzl Bloodgood Jr. and Margaret B. Howell. In his 20s, Claude both worked as a tournament director and a rating statistician. He started out with the United States Chess Federation, which I will just call it USCF, and later worked with the Virginia State Chess Federation as well. At the time, Claude claimed his chess rating set around 1956. Ratings, in case you don't know, is a system used in chess to estimate the strength of a player based on their performance against other players. So because of this, he was considered to be on the border between Class A and expert level under USCF standards. But on March 5th, 1958, the USCF actually decided to look into his claims of having such a high rating, and after analyzing his performance against some other top players, the USCF logged his rating at just 1650, a Class B level, well below what he had been claiming. It should have been the first sign that Claude had a complicated relationship with the truth, but nobody actually paid attention. Now, despite this, things seemed to be going well for Claude. The following year, in 1959, at the height of the Cold War tensions, Claude began working as a guard at the Norfolk Naval Arms Depot in Virginia. While working there, he became pen pals with a Russian player, Vladimir Koskitov, and they began playing correspondence chess, basically a long-distance game of chess which involves sending your moves to the other player by mail. Now, at the time, being in contact with someone from the Soviet Union was highly suspicious, and because Claude had exchanged letters with a Soviet player, the FBI actually began investigating him for espionage, thinking he might be a spy. But when the investigators looked into it, they found out that the letters were harmless, with no codes and nothing suspicious, just two players playing chess. So the FBI decided to drop the case. Now, Claude kept his job at the Naval Depot and kept playing chess, but sometime after that, he left. Now, no record explains why, or whether he quit or was let go. What we do know is that 3 years later, in 1962, he had relocated to Delaware, and that's when things really started to go wrong. Now, out of work and needing money, he and his friend named John Newman robbed a Stuckey's Pecan shop near Glasgow, taking around $55 in cigarettes and food. They also broke into 2 nearby gas stations, but didn't take anything from them. And it didn't take long before the two were actually caught and arrested. The court found him guilty and sentenced Claude to 5 years in prison. John, on the other hand, only received probation. Now, Claude actually fought the conviction, arguing that he never had a lawyer and never gave up his right to one. He alleged that the officials had tricked him into pleading guilty, and he was left without any proper legal counsel. But the Supreme Court threw out his appeal, calling it baseless. In a letter, it stated that he'd been offered a court-appointed attorney but refused this offer. In doing so, they assumed he waived his right to representation, and so Claude served his time in prison, but was paroled only 2 years later in 1964, although he wasn't allowed to leave the state of Virginia, which is exactly what he did though 2 years later in 1966, and so the authorities revoked his parole and sent him back to prison. He finished the sentence a year later in 1967 and moved back to Norfolk, Virginia. Now, shortly after returning in 1967, Claude began forging checks belonging to his parents. Using their checkbooks, he wrote amounts, signed his mother's signatures, and then cashed the checks at the bank, as though his parents had sent him to do so. Then one day, while checking their balance, his parents found out that money was missing from their account, and they were left pretty much broke. When they inquired into it, the bank informed them that Claude had been cashing out checks on their name. His father, Fritzl, was angry and heartbroken. He couldn't believe that his own son would do something like this to him. But when the bank asked him to press charges, he refused. He told them that he wanted to handle it within the family, and so no charges were actually filed. Fritzl tried his best to talk to Claude about this and get him to pay the stolen money back, but in response, Claude simply became abusive towards him, and so a few months later, Fritzl died, and Margaret was left shattered. She was 58 years old at the time, and losing her husband broke her in ways she hadn't expected. She couldn't look away from what she believed, that the heartbreak from what Claude had done killed his father, and so when the prosecutor in charge of the forgery case, Franklin Schwartz, later asked her to press charges again, Margaret didn't hesitate. She even told Franklin that Claude had been deeply abusive towards his father in his final days, and so this time she was done protecting him. Now, when Claude found out, he threatened to kill her if she went through with it, but Margaret no longer cared. She'd spent years softening the consequences for her son, and now she wanted to teach him a lesson, and so she told Franklin that Claude had threatened to kill her, and she pressed charges anyway and testified against him. Now, the court convicted him of forgery in 1969 and gave him a year in prison, but months later, on November 10th, 1969, the state granted him parole again. 9 days later, then 32-year-old Claude and a friend he'd met during his time in prison, Michael Quarrick, paid a visit to Margaret. That quiet evening in East Ocean View, Norfolk, Virginia, Margaret sat on the front porch of her one-story home, taking in the cool night air. She'd been planning to visit her daughter in Northern Virginia, but then Claude came up behind her, catching her off guard. He struck her head with a screwdriver and strangled her. Then he smothered her with a pillow to make sure that she was dead, while Michael simply watched in horror. When Claude confirmed that she was indeed dead, he rolled her body inside a porch rug, after which he and Michael drove 70 miles to New Kent County. But when he got there, he didn't just dump her. He placed a pillow under her head, before leaving her along a wooded road near West Point, Virginia. Now, Claude dropped Michael off in Cleveland and disappeared into New York, but Margaret's body was soon found a few hours later, and police launched an investigation immediately. And within days, they learned from Franklin that Claude had previously threatened to kill Margaret, and so Claude immediately became the prime suspect. Now Michael was actually afraid of going back to prison, and so just days after the investigation was launched, he went to the police and told them everything. And with this evidence in hand, police of course issued a warrant for Claude's arrest. But by then, Claude was nowhere to be found. He'd already fled to New York, where he maintained a low profile and stayed indoors most of the time, until 2 months later on January 31st, 1970. That day, police picked him up as a suspect in the murder of a different woman, Patricia D. Holtz, who'd been stabbed to death in Dutchess County. But investigators found no connection between him and that murder. They, however, saw his arrest warrant and transported him to Virginia to face charges for Margaret's murder instead. And at the station, Claude initially denied killing Margaret, and after several interrogations, he eventually confessed once again. But then the lies started. In hopes of getting a more lenient punishment, he claimed that Margaret wasn't his biological mother, but his stepmother. But when the police checked the medical records of Margaret and Claude, they found out that she was in fact his biological mother. But that wasn't the only lie he had. He also claimed that he didn't know where he was born, and whether it was Mexico or Germany. Then his story changed once again. He said that he was born in 1924 in Mexico as Klaus Blutgut III, 2 Nazi spies, and if true, would have made him 45 at the time of the murder, not 32. He also said that his father, Fritzl, was a German spy who had entered the United States in 1931 on forged papers. According to Claude, Fritzl had settled in Norfolk, worked at Navy Yards, and married Margaret, making her his stepmother. He also said that in 1938, at age 14, he traveled back to Germany, where he joined the Nazi Party and became an Abwehr, a German military intelligence service officer, and there he claimed he became the messenger between the spy masters and Fritzl. Now, as absurd as it sounds, to back up a story, he even showed investigators a tattoo on his arm with numbers, which he claimed were his Nazi membership number from birth. Now, on his right wrist was another tattoo of an 8-digit Swiss bank account number, which he said was where Fritzl had hidden stolen funds from Abwehr after the war. Claude then blamed the Nazis for Margaret's murder, framing it as an act of revenge for their stolen money. But when investigators of course looked into his claims, all of them turned out to be pretty much false. Now at trial, Claude proved extremely difficult. He first claimed to be innocent despite the evidence against him. He spat in his lawyer, Barry Willis's face, and threatened witnesses, lawyers, and even the judge. And the following year, in 1971, he was found guilty and sentenced to death in the electric chair. He appealed immediately. In 1972, during his appeal, his lawyer then cited Furman vs. Georgia, which is a landmark Supreme Court ruling that found the death penalty, as it was being applied at the time, violated the 8th Amendment, which is the constitutional protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Basically, the court said the way states were handing out death sentences was impulsive and that needed to stop. And because of this, Claude's sentence along with 11 other Virginia death row inmates could no longer be enforced. Instead of being executed, their sentences were reduced to life in prison. And so Claude was then sent to the Powhatan Correctional Center in Virginia. Now in prison, Claude never stopped playing chess. He played with many of the inmates, and because he was still a registered USCF member who met the requirements and had demonstrated deep knowledge of the rules, the USCF even allowed him to act as a tournament director again. So he organized chess tournaments inside the prison walls. In 1974, 3 years into his sentence, Claude and a fellow inmate named Louis Kaplener were granted temporary release to participate in a chess tournament in Virginia. However, during transport, the supervising guard made an unscheduled stop at his own home in Richmond. He had no idea that his passengers had been waiting for exactly that kind of opening, and so seizing the opportunity, Claude and Louis overpowered the guard, stole his firearm, and fled into the woods. They then called their girlfriends who helped them hide and drove them towards New York. Meanwhile, a manhunt spread across 12 states as police searched for them. Within days, both were caught, but the damage was done. Their escape caused a public uproar, and even Claude's former defense attorney, Barry, criticized the prison for granting high-risk inmates like Claude privileges outside its walls. Now, Barry even sued the Commonwealth of Virginia for allowing Claude into the community to play chess. Even with that though, Claude kept playing chess in prison. He taught other inmates how to play and even helped them get USCF memberships. And once they were registered, Claude helped them earn official ratings through real games. Now by 1997, Claude's rating had peaked at 2,789, high enough to qualify him for a Grandmaster title, had he not been serving a life sentence. Now the number also made Claude, a convicted murderer, the second highest rated player in the US at the time, and it also qualified him for the US Chess Championship in which he had applied to participate. But soon the USCF learned about his crimes and launched an investigation into him, and when they discovered his previous attempts to escape prison, the USCF didn't accept Claude's application to join the championship event. Now looking deeper, the USCF wondered how he'd gotten such a high rating in prison anyway, and then investigators uncovered that a small group playing almost exclusively against each other could artificially inflate their ratings. In some response, the USCF changed its rating system to stop it from happening again. On August 4th, 2001, more than 31 years after his arrest, Claude died of lung cancer at the Correctional Center. He was 64. During his lifetime, he published several books on opening strategies and was known for his signature style, the grub opening. Now while Claude at least left a legacy in prison, the next person we're talking about left nothing behind except unanswered questions.
He continued to talk and laugh with the people in the chamber with him, and the chemicals started to flow through his body.
Christopher J. Newton was born in Ohio on November 13, 1969. He was the youngest child of his parents and had 4 older brothers and a sister. Growing up, his parents, Jean and Lynn Newton, were mostly busy and worked opposite shifts, leaving him and his 4 siblings largely unsupervised. Now, when they weren't working, they were always fighting and screaming at each other. Jean was a rather strict dad, and he would often try to get Lynn to impose harsh punishments onto their kids, but Lynn would never follow through with them, and that only made the couple fight even more. Now, because of this toxic environment, Christopher was never really fond of spending too much time at home, and by the age of 5 in 1974, he was spending most of his time at the neighbors' houses, and his resentment for his family would only grow stronger later that year, as one of his older brothers started taking advantage of him, if you get what I mean. Now, shortly after the incidents with his older brother, Christopher set his parents' house on fire, which he claimed was an accident. His older brothers, however, didn't believe him, and started bullying him and calling him Pyro. Now, the family had to stay somewhere else, while insurance fixed the house, which took them 6 months, but even afterwards, Christopher would continue to get abused by his older brothers. Then in 1981, at age 11, a neighbor also began taking advantage of him, and after that, something in Christopher went quiet. He stopped talking to anyone, completely isolating himself, and no one in his family bothered to ask why. Instead, his parents simply took vacations with his other siblings and left Christopher at his grandmother's house. Now, this didn't help. In fact, it made Christopher shut down completely. To him, the message was clear. They would rather give up on him than bother to care. So he responded the only way he knew, by abusing substances, stealing, and indulging in inappropriate acts. By this time, his problems had become impossible to ignore, and so his parents took him to Berea Children's Home in Monroe Falls, Ohio, a residential facility for mentally troubled kids and orphans. There, staff immediately flagged him as one of the most at-risk kids they'd ever seen, not because he was violent, but because of how emotionally withdrawn he was and the inappropriate behaviors he was displaying at such a young age. Even then, Christopher's behavior wasn't criminal just yet, as his first interaction with the police didn't happen until 1990. That year, 21-year-old Christopher broke into a house and was arrested for burglary and grand theft. Although it's unclear what happened after the arrest, what we do know is that the charges were dropped. But it didn't stop there. The following year, in 1991, he broke into multiple more houses, and in June 1992, he was arrested again. This time, he was convicted of attempted aggravated burglary and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But ironically, Christopher kinda liked prison actually. There, he could spend the entire day all by himself, without anyone bothering him, and for the first time in his life, he felt at peace. However, Christopher only served 7 of the 15 years he was supposed to spend, and in 1999, at the age of 30, he was released on parole, and he hated it. Christopher didn't feel like he belonged on the outside. The structure of the prison, the schedules, walls, and isolation felt too familiar and more peaceful than home ever was. And so a few weeks after his release, Christopher broke into another home for the sole purpose of getting arrested again. But he didn't just pick a random house. This time he broke into his own father's house. Jean had made it clear after Christopher's first conviction that he wasn't welcome at home, but Christopher didn't care. He knew that no one would be home that day, just as well as he knew how to get in. So he went there anyway, hoping Jean would call the cops on him and he'd get arrested again. But Jean actually simply ignored him and told him to leave. And a few days later, Christopher tried to break into another house in Sandusky County while being armed with a gun. This time the police caught him in the act, and his parole was then revoked and he was taken back to prison. Now when he was arrested, the police were surprised to see that Christopher didn't try to talk his way out of it or escape. He now faced the charges burglary, attempted burglary, and illegal possession of a weapon, despite having prior convictions. Now when the case went to court the same year, he was convicted on all 3. He was then given an additional 8 to 15 years imprisonment to be served alongside the 8 years he was already supposed to serve before his parole. However, the next year in 2000, Christopher actually tried to escape from prison, but guards caught him before he could actually make it out. Now for a while after that, Christopher served a sentence without having any trouble. But then the next year, on October 16, 2001, he reported to the prison guards that an inmate had threatened to stab him and asked them for protective custody. Otherwise, Christopher said he'll kill the inmate who had threatened him. Now guards took the threat seriously and moved Christopher to protective custody at Mansfield Correctional Institution. He was sent there alongside another inmate named Jason Brewer, who was already serving time for burglary as well. Now the 2 convicts were then placed in cell 115. Jason was 27 at the time. He'd grown up in Ohio and was easygoing in the way that people who've learned to make the best of bad situations often are. And just like Christopher, Jason was also taken advantage of in his childhood home. and soon afterward he became a ward of the state at a very young age. He was then adopted by an employee of Lucas County Children's Services, but before long the same thing started happening again, and his adoptive father was convicted on charges related to taking advantage of people in 1986. After that, Jason bounced from foster home to foster home, and by 1994, when he was around 20, he was looking at a hefty prison sentence on an attempted aggravated burglary conviction. His public defender said that the judge handed down an extreme sentence because at the time there was a strict crackdown on crime going on, and like a lot of people who'd grown up the way he had, he ended up inside. Now for a while he settled into prison life without much drama, until a few weeks back when he started being bullied by other inmates. He then asked for protective custody because he believed that some of them had intentions to harm him. Now on paper, other than a history of abuse and burglary charges, Jason and Christopher didn't have much in common, except their shared height. They were both 5'11", though Christopher outweighed Jason by nearly 100 pounds. And what they did have in common was chess. Both men actually loved it, and in cell 115, the board became the center of their days. They played constantly, talked trash about the prison guards, and made bets on their games, and even caught feelings for one another and started making love every now and then. But Jason had a habit, one that drove Christopher out of his mind. You see, whenever Jason could see he was losing a game, he'd simply quit, and Christopher hated it. To him, quitting was cowardly and disrespectful. And on November 15, 2001, Jason did it again. Early that morning, they made a bet on the game. But while playing, Jason noticed that he was losing, and so he pushed the board aside and said that he wasn't playing anymore. And this made Christopher snap, and they began arguing. This argument, however, quickly turned into a fight, and Christopher started punching Jason continuously until he began bleeding from his mouth and nose. And then the fight died down, and they simply went back to their beds. But while getting to his bunk, Christopher sat down and began cutting his uniform using a razor blade while Jason tried to sleep. Then by 3:30 AM, just as Jason was about to sleep, Christopher reached out to him. He asked him to come over to his bunk so they could get freaky under their sheets, but Jason ignored him. So Christopher became furious, went over to Jason's bunk and dragged him to the floor. He then slammed Jason's head and stomped his throat before grabbing the piece of cloth he'd cut from his uniform, wrapping it around Jason's neck, strangling him. And he didn't stop until Jason stopped struggling. But Jason wasn't actually dead yet, he was just unconscious. And when Christopher noticed that Jason was still breathing, he took the blade and cut into Jason's body and drank his blood. Now it wasn't until an hour later that the prison guards walked by and saw Jason lying on the floor with a piece of an orange cloth wrapped around his neck. He was barely breathing and was bleeding. Now while all of this was going on, Christopher stood at a corner, laughing, with Jason's blood smeared all over his face. He told the guards while laughing hysterically,
"Let him die. I killed him. That you might as well not even work on him. He's already dead."
And when the guards tried to help Jason, Christopher yelled,
"Stop. Let the die."
And the nurses were also called immediately, and they barely managed to restart Jason's heart. And by the time they reached the nearest hospital, Med Central, Jason was brain dead, with no chance of even recovering. And when he was asked why he killed Jason, he said,
"He kept giving up. Every time I put him in check, he'd give up and want to start a new game. And I tried to tell him you never give up. I just got tired of it."
Eventually, his first court appearance for Jason's murder came, and Christopher was brought before a 3-judge panel in Ohio. He pleaded guilty and even waived all appeals. Now during his trial, one of the nurses on duty that night of the incident, Trina Butcher, testified. She told the jury that when she saw the blood on Christopher's face, she had thought that he was injured and tried to treat him first. But when she attended to him, he told her that the blood belonged to Jason, and he'd painted himself in Jason's blood and also drank some of it as some sort of a ritual. She recounted his words to the jury.
"There's nothing like the taste of fresh blood in the morning."
And the judge also learned from the prosecutors that during Christopher's arrest in 1999, he had told a mental health professional that he intended to kill someone in prison, so he could stay there permanently. And with this information and Christopher's guilty plea, the court sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Now you have to know, sentences like this are usually mostly appealed against, since they are seen as extreme. But in this case, Christopher didn't even fight the sentence. Instead, he was pleased with it and welcomed it. His family even tried to change his mind and asked him to appeal the sentence, but Christopher simply refused. Even when the governor agreed to review the case, which would have given him the chance of getting his death sentence reduced to life without parole, Christopher told authorities that he would only cooperate with them if they assured them that they would execute him. Now eventually, his wish was granted, and on May 24th, 2007, 38-year-old Christopher was set to be executed by lethal injection. But on the morning of execution, Christopher's sister, Lisa, and his cousin, Kathy, came to visit him. They had to come see him one last time to say their goodbyes, and when it was time, they were escorted out and asked to wait in the parking lot with other protesters who'd gathered, because they were against the execution and thought it was inhumane. Now neither Lisa nor Kathy would get to see Christopher alive again. Now meanwhile inside, the execution team was finding it hard to inject Christopher because of his weight. They couldn't find a viable vein, and they kept trying over 10 times, which took nearly 2 hours. Now finally on the 11th try, they successfully injected him, and Christopher was then pronounced dead. Now before the execution though, Christopher had written letters to his family and Jason's family, saying,
"To all those I've hurt in the past, please forgive me. I hope this execution gives everyone closure. To Jason's family, I'm sorry I caused you so much pain and suffering. If I could take it back, I would. To my family, I love you and I'm sorry."
Then witnesses at the execution chamber later said that Christopher stayed calm throughout the entire process. He even cracked jokes with the medical staff and did belly laughs. And while he was on the gurney, which is the stretcher he was strapped to, his last words were,
"Yes, boy, I sure could use a beef stew and a chicken bone."
But while Christopher Newton spent years trying to get the state to kill him, and eventually it did, this next man spent years using chess to survive. He never asked for anything, he just kept score.
Nikolai was a normal man. He boasted that he'd been imprisoned a couple of times for fraud. He came to Lipetsk in 1986 from Georgia. All this time he was homeless. He had a passion, chess. He earned his living from them, playing for money in Lower Park. Almost never lost. And about a year ago, something happened to him.
These were the words of a friend, one of the few who ever truly got close to Nikolai Pavlovich Shubin. Nikolai, the Russian, was born in 1956 in Tbilisi, Georgia, into a poor family. As a child, he worked at a tram depot to help support his family, but the money still wasn't enough. So a few years later, Nikolai left a job and went in search of greener pastures. He even moved to Voronezh Oblast in central Russia to stay with his relatives. In Voronezh, Nikolai started a business. He began producing counterfeit jeans and bootleg alcohol, which were illegal underground operations that kept him under the radar. Soon after, his business actually boomed, and while he now had money, he was just about to learn that money wasn't all that mattered. Because in 1976, at age 20, Nikolai became ill, and doctors at a regional clinic told him that he had neurasthenia, basically a diagnosis in the Soviet Union for when someone's nervous system seemed to be breaking down under pressure. And because of it, Nikolai was constantly exhausted, irritable, and emotionally unstable. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. He couldn't work, couldn't focus, and had to stop everything, including his business. Now feeling better 8 years later, in 1984, Nikolai resumed his underground business, but he'd barely resumed it when the police arrested him for speculation. In Soviet law, speculation meant buying and reselling goods for profit, which was a criminal offense at the time, because the government was of course communist. And so he was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison, but for some reason he served only 2 of those 4 years before being released in 1986. Now after his release, Nikolai tried to turn over a new leaf, or at least that's how it looked. He got married and worked a steady job for a while. From the outside, it looked like things were finally going right, but it didn't last. Nikolai and his wife started having marital issues, and they then divorced. When it was over, Nikolai was alone again, even more than before. Since he had no wife and no real reason to stay in Voronezh, he decided to move to Lipetsk. In Lipetsk, he only continued to struggle. He had no stable income and no place of his own, and so he slept by the bus stop at night and wandered the streets during the day begging for food and work. Now eventually, he was barely able to scrape enough to afford a place of his own. But while Nikolai's life wasn't rosy, he found one thing that kept him going: chess. Almost every day he would go to Nezhny Park in Lipetsk, and there he would often play for small amounts of money. Yet despite being a very good player, Nikolai didn't really have friends, and most people kept their distance because of how untidy and messy he looked. Other players in the park even gave him a nickname, Varela Bombs, which meant Varela the Homeless in English. And over time, one person did get close to Nikolai though. His name was Victor. Victor was Nikolai's neighbor, and also a retiree with a family. He came to the park most days, not because he had nothing else to do, but because he genuinely enjoyed it. Of everyone who'd ever sat across from Nikolai at the board, Victor was the one who actually talked to him and kept coming back to play with him. And so the two became friends. Now years would pass, and somewhere along the way, Nikolai ended up being homeless again, and he just simply drifted through Lipetsk, playing chess, sleeping wherever he could, and scraping by. Then in 2004, Nikolai invited a man, who I'll call Peter, to play chess at an abandoned building inside the park. Peter was also a homeless man who passed through Nezhny Park most afternoons. He had no fixed address and no family or friends, but he knew chess and he played it well. Now Peter wasn't a stranger to Nikolai. They had seen each other around the park enough times that sitting down together to play chess didn't feel unusual. Now the game began, and Peter, who was a better player than Nikolai, actually won. But Nikolai didn't take the loss exactly well, and Peter had no idea what was coming for him, because then, in a sudden fit of rage, Nikolai attacked and killed Peter. And Nikolai soon learned that he had a thirst for killing, because not long after, he developed a habit where he would invite men to play chess, suggested that they move to somewhere quieter, like an abandoned corner of the park or an empty building nearby, and if his opponent won, he would knock them unconscious with something heavy, tie their hands and feet with wire, and then waited for them to wake up, because what came next required them to be conscious. When his victims regained consciousness, Nikolai read to them a long prepared statement about how they had been living their lives wrong. He would then tell them that they deserved what was coming for them and strangled them. and no matter how they begged or threatened him, nothing changed. So technically, if a player wanted to survive, all he needed to do is lose to him. But his victims couldn't have possibly known this until it was too late. Like in the case of Alexander, Nikolai's targets were also homeless men. Because he was a homeless man himself, he knew others like him who had no families nearby or any social connections that would make their disappearance go noticed. In the span of 2 years, he'd killed 12 people, and their identities were never really made public. Then in 2006, Nikolai made a mistake. In the first week of October, Nikolai played a game of chess with his friend, Victor, in which they'd bet 30 rubles, which was barely $1 at the time. Victor won, and for Nikolai, that was enough. He then led Victor to the garages at the lower park. There he picked something heavy and hit Victor from the behind before strangling his only friend to death. But since Victor had a family who looked out for him, when he failed to return home that evening, he was actually reported missing. And because Nikolai was the last person seen with Victor before his disappearance, the district police brought him in for questioning. Now he said nothing and was soon released. But on October 6, 2006, the police then formally arrested him. This time at the station, Nikolai actually confessed immediately. He described exactly what he'd done, and then he offered to take them to where he'd buried Victor. Now the next day he confessed to another murder and took them to the burial site as well. About a week later he confessed to another. Each new week brought about a new body, a new confession, but still no sign of remorse. And when investigators asked him why he'd done it, Nikolai said,
"They all wore masks, and I cleansed this world of evil. In real life they were different, and I saw it clearly."
As the police would later discover, Nikolai buried most of his victims in the Avtoljupitel 3 garage cooperative of Lesnaya Street in the city's left bank district. One body was even found in a bush about 328 feet from the local police station, practically in their yard. Now, 2 other bodies turned up near the old entrance of the Novolipetsk metallurgical plant. Now, Nikolai was pretty proud of how he'd disposed of the bodies, and even gave himself a title, the cemetery director. To him, he'd built himself a cemetery, and directed how the lives of many ended, which is technically true. Now, shortly after his arrest, the lead investigator was to be promoted, and another investigator was assigned to his case, but Nikolai refused. He threatened that he would only cooperate with his previous investigator, and no one else. And so she stayed on the case. Now, months later, a news outlet interviewed an old homeless friend of Nikolai, who told them that Nikolai had attempted to kill him as well. He said,
"And about a year ago, something happened to him. He became hot-tempered and irritable. One day, out of the blue, he attacked me. He grabbed me by my throat and began to choke me. He became completely brutal, yelling about what it would be like to have his 2 hands to the side for him. I barely escaped and moved to live in another sewer. Since then, I have tried to stay away from Nikolai."
Yet despite a full confession and a witness account, a psychiatric evaluation declared Nikolai legally insane, and so he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And because of this, the court found him unfit to stand trial and sentenced him to compulsory treatment instead. Like Nikolai, who had a ritual, a reason he could recite on command, this next case had one as well. A reason so pitiful that even his daughter found it hard to believe. Liao was 54 years old, and he lived alone in room 402, a rented apartment in Jinhua, Zhejiang. In 2013, he and his wife got divorced, right after they had a daughter, who I'll call Leah. At first, Liao tried to keep in touch with Leah as she grew up, but soon after Liao quit his job as a cleaner, he isolated himself from the outside world completely and cut all contact with everyone, including his own daughter. And at the time, his only friend was a 57-year-old man named Zhu. They had met at a local park over a chessboard, and from then on, they began playing with each other on a regular basis. Now, Zhu was a pretty chill and laid-back dude who never really pushed Liao to talk or socialize beyond simply playing chess every now and then. And for Liao, that was all he needed, or at least so he thought. But as days went by, the reality of his life came at him. He had no wife, he had no contact to his own daughter, and even Zhu, his only friend, was far away in his own home. And that led to the decision he took on October 20th, 2013. That day, tired and alone, Liao decided he couldn't bear it anymore. And while he sat in the dark corner of his room, he decided to leave this earth. But before doing so, he wrote a note letting out his pain. He said his reason was that his loneliness had become too much and he wanted to find peace. However, when it was time to actually leave this earth, Liao couldn't go through with it. He then put the note away, and for 2 months, he didn't make any further attempts. He continued living his life as he used to, lonely and isolated. Then, in December of 2013, Zhu came to Liao to ask for help. He had nowhere to stay, and Liao was the only one he truly trusted. And for Liao, nothing would make him happier than having Zhu close to him. So he asked his landlady, Wu, if Zhu could stay in room 403, right next door to him, and she actually agreed, and Zhu moved in. For a week, he was happier than he'd been in 10 years. But then, for some reason, the thought about leaving this earth started slowly coming back, and he didn't know why. He had thought Zhu's presence would cure his loneliness, but it didn't. So once again, he decided to try, and on December 23rd, 2013, he was finally ready to do it. This time, he promised himself he would go through with it. But Liao didn't want to be alone even in death, His greatest fear wasn't dying. It was that it would be just as lonely as his life had been. So he thought that if Ju came with him, they could play chess together in the afterlife. And so he had to make sure that Ju actually came with him. And so that same day, Liao went to Ju's room and gave him a drugged drink. And after sipping from it, Ju felt weak. Then, using his bare hands, Liao strangled Ju, laying him down carefully on the floor in his room before leaving for his own room. And back in his room, Liao then drank pesticide and slowly died of heart failure. The next day, Wu came by to collect rent from the tenants. And when it was Liao's turn to pay her, she knocked on his door repeatedly, but there wasn't an answer. And so she immediately became concerned and asked the neighbors. Well, they told her that neither Liao nor his friend Ju had been out that day. She then went to Ju's room and knocked, thinking they were in there. But again, nothing. And so Wu let herself in, but the moment she opened the door, a foul stench hit her. Then she saw Ju's body lying on the floor and immediately screamed and called the police. When the police arrived, she told them that Ju was friends with the man next door. The police then asked her to open room 402 to confirm Liao's whereabouts. And when she did, the sharp smell of pesticides hit them as well, and they found Liao's body on the floor. Beside his body, they found 2 notes. The first was a note he'd written back in October, when he first considered leaving this earth. And the second was a confession. In it, he admitted killing Ju. He explained that he wanted to make sure Ju would be waiting for him in heaven so they could play chess together. And when investigators told Leah about what her father had done, she refused to believe it. She said that her father wasn't capable of hurting anyone, and definitely not his only friend. Nevertheless, while Liao had nothing and still caused harm, this next case had everything: reputation, influence, chess, and he used all of it.
We condemned him, obviously, but we didn't want to jump to any conclusions because we didn't have a lot of details. Now, logically, it felt like there will be more details.
By the time Alejandro Ramirez was 15 years old, the chess world had already gotten to know his name. He was a Costa Rican American and had started playing chess in 1992 at just 4 years of age. His father, George Ramirez, was a chess player himself, and he taught Alejandro how to play and even signed him up for chess clubs and tournaments. But Alejandro's actual inspiration to play chess came from a movie called Searching for Bobby Fischer. The film was about a child prodigy wanting to be the best chess player in the world, and Alejandro wasn't just watching, he was actually taking notes even at that young age. And so when he was 10 years old, Alejandro had already won the under 10 division of the Pan American Youth Chess Festival, earning himself the title of FIDE Master, the second highest rank in chess. Now, for those who don't know, in chess, titles work like a ladder. You start with Candidate Master, then move up to FIDE Master, and after that, International Master, and then the highest title a player can earn, Grandmaster. And so at this point, Alejandro was already climbing up the chess ladder. About 5 years later, at age 15, Alejandro became a Grandmaster. This made him the youngest Grandmaster in the world and the very first in Central America. But that wasn't the only credential Alejandro was known for. Academically, a few years later, he earned a master's degree in arts and technology from the University of Texas, Dallas. So basically, at 23 years old, Alejandro was already known across borders in the chess world, and almost all federations wanted him. And so in 2011, he switched from Costa Rican Chess Federation to the United States Chess Federation and began playing chess tournaments for them. In the US, his ELO, or rating, which are basically the points that show how strong of a player you are, reached its peak at 2600. Now with this, he started working with one of the biggest chess clubs in the US, St. Louis, and even became coach for the St. Louis University chess team in 2013.
We're going to do a little bit of opening preparation today. We're going to understand a little bit why some of the openings that exist.
Now, after working with the club for a while, he became their highest paid employee of the club in 2018 and 2019. He even assisted Fabiano Caruana, the reigning 5-time US champion and Italian-American grandmaster, to prepare for one of his 2018 World Chess Championship games. Now, on the surface, Alejandro had everything. He had a reputation, influence, and access to players across the country. But beyond the titles and trophies, something else was building, and it wasn't the good kind. In 2020, Grandmaster Jennifer Shahade, a 2-time US women's chess champion and also one of the most prominent figures in American chess, heard the news that Alejandro was going to commentate on the US Junior Girls Championship, and she wasn't really happy about this. This was because years earlier, Alejandro had harassed her. So when she heard the news, she immediately called the St. Louis club and reported it. But instead of investigating this situation, the club dismissed Jennifer and told her to go call him himself and work their personal problems out. Now, even though Jennifer didn't like the idea of speaking to Alejandro again, on the day of the opening ceremony in October 2020, she called Alejandro anyway. She confronted him directly and asked him not to commentate on the Junior Girls Championship. According to her, after the call dropped, he called back and apologized. He then agreed to step down. But Alejandro's decision to step away from the role wasn't enough for Jennifer. Jennifer. She wanted justice, and since the club wasn't doing anything about it, she decided to report him to the USCF itself. Now when the USCF heard the accusation, they told her that they would investigate it, but months passed and the results of their findings were never released, and Alejandro continued living his life like every normal professional chess player. Now when Jennifer saw that nothing had been done to Alejandro and the USCF was quiet, she complained to her brother, Greg Shahade. Now the following year in 2021, Greg also learned that Alejandro had also allegedly harassed a young girl, so he decided to report this to the club himself, hoping they would do something about Alejandro this time. But again, the club didn't take him seriously. Instead, they dismissed him and told him that they will get back to him. Now after waiting for about 2 months for their reply, one day Greg received a letter from the club's lawyer. In it, they admitted that they were aware of the allegations against Alejandro. However, they told Greg that they weren't aware of any actual misconduct he'd done over the years, and that without proof, they were simply baseless allegations. They even said that they weren't the right body to investigate the allegations and asked him to take this report somewhere else. And so Alejandro never faced any disciplinary action from them. Instead, the club continued to back him, and they even assigned him to coach the US women's team at the 2022 World Chess Olympiad and allowed him to commentate on events. But this still didn't stop Jennifer from seeking justice. This time, she decided to take things online. On February 16, 2023, she made a post on X, accusing Alejandro, who was then 34 years old, of making unwanted advances towards her twice. She said,
"Currently, there are multiple investigations underway on Alejandro Ramirez on misconduct, including a series of alleged incidents involving a younger person. I was attacked by him twice, 9 and 10 years ago."
She then added,
"I'd moved on until the past couple of years, when multiple women, independent of each other and with no knowledge of my own experience, approached me with their own stories of alleged attacks. These accounts were from much younger alleged victims. I saw alarming evidence, including texts that admitted attack of a younger person while he was coaching her, as well as a text to an alleged victim about being an not-of-age temptress."
Now after she posted this in a follow-up tweet, she said,
"4 more women have contacted me about alleged misconduct from Alejandro, ranging from harassment to assault to doing stuff to students. 7 if including secondhand reports."
The next day, she made another post saying,
7 additional women have reached out to me with stories of alleged attack by Alejandro Ramirez since my original post."
Now Jennifer's tweets went viral and many chess reporters carried it, yet it wasn't enough to bring Alejandro to justice. Then a month later, in March 2023, the Wall Street Journal published a piece called
"How SA allegations against a US chess grandmaster went unaddressed for years."
Now this piece featured allegations from 8 anonymous women accusing Alejandro of misconduct. It revealed that these allegations had begun even as far back as 12 years ago in 2011, and no one had known them. It revealed that in 2011, 23-year-old Alejandro had harassed a younger player, who was at the time 8 years younger than him. They were at a chess camp and he was her instructor, and Alejandro had asked the girl, who we will call Esther, to bring toothpaste to his room, and when she did, inside his room,
he apparently shoved her against the counter and began forcefully kissing her even as she tried to turn her head away.
Now in a later tournament, Esther said he also pinned her to his hotel bed and started kissing and doing stuff before she escaped. The piece also stated that Esther wasn't the only victim, and that there were at least 3 other girls who were very young when Alejandro did stuff to them. And some of the other accounts of the women shared similarities with that of Esther's. They met Alejandro while he was a coach or senior player, then he made advances on them, and if they tried to resist, he became violent towards them. Now one of the girls even said that Alejandro had given her vodka before doing stuff. The piece then revealed something that Jennifer didn't even know. It said that before Greg had reported the harassment to the club in 2021, 5 years ago in 2016, the girl had reported the attack to St. Louis. But instead of taking the reports to the authorities, the club simply warned her to avoid being alone with Alejandro after parties. Another victim's mother also complained to major US chess officials in 2017 about his inappropriate behavior towards her daughter. And just like the 2016 case and that of Jennifer's, no one intervened. The victim's mother even said that she sat in a room where top executives at the club had gathered, and she overheard them, laughing and joking about Alejandro's interest in young women. Then the program manager at the World Chess Hall of Fame in St. Louis, Claire Groth, also shared her experience with Alejandro after meeting him at an after party of a reception organized by St. Louis in 2014. She said they were having a conversation somewhere around the back near the restroom when Alejandro grabbed her by the arm and reached into her dress to, do stuff. Now she didn't want it, so she immediately pushed him off and left. Yet Alejandro tried again the following day. He approached her at the office and asked her out despite her reaction from last night.
"I was horrified at that point."
According to her, the incident led her to resign from a job at the World Chess Hall of Fame. And after the piece ran, the USCF was criticized for doing nothing despite Jennifer's initial report. Now because of this, they announced that they were finally publicly opening an investigation on the allegations, since the world was now finally seeing Alejandro for who he was. St. Louis Club also then admitted that they
remained silent for too long and should have done more to address the allegations.
They added that they also hired an independent law firm to conduct an investigation on Alejandro, and just 2 days after the report was published, Alejandro was actually finally forced to step down from his coaching role at the university and his position at the club. Still, he didn't want to accept his wrongdoings, and in a press release issued by his lawyer, Alejandro claimed that his reason for stepping down was because of the investigation by the USCF, which he referred to as a
Negative distractions.
and since no criminal charges had been filed against Alejandro and he was still legally free, everyone waited eagerly for the results of the investigations. Now 2 months later, in May of 2023, the USCF concluded its investigation, and they found Alejandro guilty of the allegations, and so they banned him for life and stripped him of all of his titles. Meanwhile, St. Louis claimed that they couldn't carry out their own investigation properly because Alejandro wasn't responding to them. Yet, even with the ban, Alejandro still reportedly plays chess and attends non-USCF events. But you see, Alejandro isn't the only powerful man in chess accused of crossing the line. He's part of a pattern, just like the man in the next case. In competitive chess, titles mean everything, and earning the International Master title from the FIDE, which is the global governing body for chess, is a rare achievement, and fewer than 4,000 people in history have ever held it. And Andrei Srebkovs was one of them. Based in Riga, the capital of Latvia, Andrei had spent years building a reputation inside the chess community. He was a coach and held the title of International Master in chess, which again is the second highest title. Like the case of Alejandro, he was exactly the kind of figure the chess world respected. But it turned out that for over a decade, while Andres was earning that reputation, he was also doing something else entirely. Somewhere between 2009 and 2023, mysterious envelopes began arriving at addresses across Europe. They showed up at homes, chess clubs, university mailboxes, and even tournament venues of some female competitors. The return addresses labeled on these envelopes would have the names of well-known male players and respective figures in the chess world, as though the letters had come from them, and some even bore names of rival players that the female competitor had just faced across the board. Now inside these mysterious envelopes were explicit magazine spreads, and in some of them even used articles. Now the recipients were female chess players, mainly Russian competitors. Some were under 30 when the letters arrived, and 5 were teenagers at the time. Now one of those teenagers was a competitive player in the UK, who'd been traveling to tournaments since childhood. I'll call her Mia. In 2009, one of those envelopes appeared at Mia's parents' home. Mia later said that the realization hit her immediately. Someone had looked her up, written down where she lived, and sent it to her anyway. Now another letter arrived at a chess club in Moscow, addressed to a very young girl who, just like Mia, had dedicated her entire childhood to the game. Now she had won 5 world championships before most kids her age had figured out what they were good at, and holds the title of Grandmaster. Her name was Bibisara Azobeva. When the letter arrived, the club's director, Sergei Nesterov, opened it first, and what he found made him call the police immediately. Inside, as Liana, Bibisara's mother would later describe,
Was a page of a explicit magazine where 2 or 3 men did stuff to another person, and there was a used item as well.
and the return label bore the name of a former FIDE world champion who'd recently played against Bibisara in a match. And these letters kept coming for years to different women. At least 15 of these had received letters from the same sender, and when these victims reported what happened to other players, to chess authorities, and even government officials, they were told more than once that what had been done to them was not serious enough to investigate. And so the letters continued. In February of 2022, the independent Russian journal Medusa published an investigation titled
It sounds like a cry from the heart, but I don't know what it's screaming about. For over 10 years, someone has been sending Russian chess players letters containing used items and explicit magazines. We found this person.
According to Medusa, someone posting on Russian forums under the handle Afromiv's Cat, who I'll just call Cat, had been posting things that sounded and looked suspiciously similar to the contents of the letters, such as similar language, targets, and even interests. Cat's profile picture was a photograph of Anna Butasova, a Russian-born Canadian chess player who became a grandmaster in 2009, and Anna's younger sister had also received one of those letters. In the article, Russian international master Alina Bivol revealed that she'd received 15 of such letters. She described them as
Completely impersonal.
identical from one to the next, with only the supposed sender's name changed on each one. At the end of the article, Medusa named their suspect, Latvian international master Andres. This was because the letters had been postmarked from Riga, where Andres lived, and apart from this, his official forum posts also shared similarities with the letter's contents, and posts made by Cat. And when reporters attempted to reach him for a comment before publication, he was unreachable. Now the journal went viral and caught the attention of the FIDE, so they opened an investigation, and its Ethics and Disciplinary Commission, which is the committee in charge of punishing chess players all over the world, began reviewing the evidence. According to them, what they found could only be described as a
Disturbing pattern of harassment spanning more than a decade.
And 2 years later, in 2024, DNA extracted from the used items was matched, and it belonged to Andres. So in August 2024, the FIDE FIDE gave Andres a 5-year ban, which meant that he was prohibited from participating or attending any FIDE-sanctioned events and from coaching under their authority for 5 years. But this punishment wasn't enough for many of his victims, and the Swedish player Anna Kramling Bellin, who holds the title of Woman FIDE Master, thought so too. In a podcast interview hosted by the sports commentator Askild Bryn and renowned Norwegian player Odin Blirka Ve, the following month in September 2024, 22-year-old Anna, who had received a few letters from Andres himself when she was younger, described the harm the letters had caused, not only to adult competitors, but to younger people.
This man had the addresses of all these people and sent something so disgusting to these young girls.
She argued that a temporary ban did not reflect what had actually been done.
I think his sentence should have been much stricter. He should have a minimum of 30 to 40 years. 5 years is way too little.
And the comments that followed agreed with her. One commenter said,
I'm amazed that Anna manages to be such a positive and upbeat person in light of the degree of harassment she'd faced since she was a literal young person. 5 years is not long enough.
He then asked a question to cut to the core of it, adding,
what benefit does anyone gain by allowing this dude back at all?
Now another comment read,
this is absolutely horrendous. A 5-year ban is not enough. This player should be banned for life. And people wonder why there aren't more women in chess.
Now as the comments and backlashes kept coming, the FIDE decided to review Andres' punishment, and on January 27, 2025, they announced an extended ban of 12 years and revoked Andres' international master title, making him the first person in FIDE history to have the title stripped. However, when authorities tried to pursue criminal charges, Latvian law enforcement concluded that what Andres had done was technically not illegal under Latvian law, and when the Russian victims even reported to its own authorities, they were told the same thing. So Andres remained legally free, and he made it clear that he intended to stay that way. In his response to FIDE's findings, Andres argued that the letters were private correspondence between individuals and unrelated to any official chess activity. He claimed FIDE had no authority to investigate him at all, and he insisted that there was no evidence that his actions had caused any psychological harm to his victims. According to him, the center's intentions remained, in his words, unknown, and that any distress his victims experienced may not have been intentional. Now this made the FIDE believe that he still could be a threat to females in the chess world, despite his punishment. In a press release, they stated that because of his prior status as a titled player and coach, vulnerable female players could still come into contact with him. And that concern proved justified, because in August of 2024, the same month his ban was issued, Andres still showed up at a chess tournament in Hungary and attempted to compete. Now luckily he was recognized by other players and they reported him to the tournament director, and only then was he asked to leave. Now while Andres' case revealed that harassing people wasn't a crime in some countries, in this next case we learned why, and how the game's prestige is valued more than the sanity of its female chess players.
Sadly, I'm not surprised at all. It's the reason I stopped playing chess, and it's something that's completely prevalent, but it's been sat on and suppressed for several years. I guess they don't want to ruin the image that chess is a gentleman's game and it's full of well-to-do people and nothing bad ever happens in it, but sadly it's a very common occurrence.
Sabrina Chevanes was born in 1986 in Sutton Coldfield, Birmingham, England. Her father taught her how to play chess when she was 8, and from the ages of 14 to 16 she rose through the ranks in junior chess, winning for herself multiple British titles. In 2013, at just 27 years old, she became an international master, and Sabrina was just getting started. The next year, in August 2014, Sabrina represented England in the world's largest and most prestigious international chess tournament, FIDE's Chess Olympia, where she scored 4.5 points out of 8, meaning she had 4 wins, 1 draw and 3 losses. But while this may have looked like a success for Sabrina, her experience inside the chess world was far more complicated. According to her, in 1997, when she wasn't even yet a teenager, a male chess player whom name she withheld had forcefully done stuff to her. She said he even made multiple inappropriate comments to her during tournaments and that she was frightened.
I was young. I wanted to have a picture with him because he was famous in the world. He posed for the picture, but did this thing where he put his hands down my back. He then turned around and winked at me.
And her story doesn't stop there. She recalled that on one occasion, this same player had said,
"You're developing so well."
She replied, thinking that he meant her chess rating.
"I am at my best rating."
He then responded telling her,
"No, I don't mean developing like that."
Then, 8 years later, in 2002, Sabrina says she attended a tournament and woke up the next morning in a hotel room in physical pain, with no memory of what had happened the night before, and she thinks that someone may have put stuff in her drink. But worse, she said that the man she believed had done stuff to her boasted about the incidents to his friends as well. According to her,
"While playing chess, I was in so much pain, I could barely sit down. He and his friends were high-fiving about it."
And this hurt Sabrina deeply. In 2017, when she could no longer bear the stuff she had suffered, Sabrina retired from professional chess at the age of 31. It wasn't until 6 years later, in an interview with the Times Radio in 2023 titled "SA and Misogyny in Chess," that Sabrina told the world the real reasons for leaving the game.
women are seen as inferior. They genuinely believe men are superior to women in every way, including intellectual. If you beat someone, it's described as you ate them.
Now she described the culture in the chess community where the officials were more concerned about protecting the game's reputation than protecting the women within it. In her words,
"It's the reason I stopped playing chess. It's completely prevalent, it's something that has been sat on and suppressed for many years. I guess they don't want to ruin the image that chess is a gentleman's game."
She explained that she experienced harassment in nearly every tournament she attended.
"It's a constant fear at tournaments you go to, and you cannot relax. You constantly get hit on by men. You're propositioned to go back to their room. You're forced into situations you don't want to be in. Then you see even worse situations where people are promising that you will get XYZ, whether that is a selection for a team place or whether it's coaching, if you do other inappropriate behavior with them. This is just normal at all these events, which is absolutely terrifying. That's obviously on top of all the things that go on, which are just general everyday misogyny and sexism. It's atrocious."
Now when the interview aired, it caused a major controversy within the chess community. While many called her brave, according to her,
"Unfortunately, all men have replied very negatively about it."
All men, unfortunately, have replied very, very negatively about it. You can check out the YouTube video, which has comments such as, "Don't like the heat, get out the kitchen, who cares, no one cares about you, Sabrina, so what, let men be men." And, you know, this is what we're talking about.
She then responded with a video explaining that
"Misogyny is one thing, but there's a huge problem with her saying. It's dismissed and it's completely normal. It's terrifying."
The misogyny is one thing, but there's also a huge prevalence of assault, and it goes on as far in chess. And it's completely normal in the chess world. The official bodies don't seem to care. You know, seeing so many men dismiss assault like it's completely nothing absolutely terrifies me.
A few months later, in August 2023, Sabrina gave another interview, this time with The Independent. In this interview, Sabrina described an incident that took place when she was already an adult. She said that while competing in a tournament, she couldn't check into her hotel room until mid-afternoon, but she was jet-lagged and needed to sleep, so another male player offered to let her sleep in his room. According to her,
"He wasn't in the room when I was sleeping, but I woke up to find one hand down and one hand somewhere else."
She also said that it happened a second time.
"He did the same thing again when I was in the same house as him and lots of others in the chess community."
Now when she was asked by the interviewer why she never went to the authorities, Sabrina explained that her colleagues had discouraged her from reporting it and had warned her that no one would believe her and that it would pretty much damage her career. Now in the same interview, Sabrina said that she also faced racism within the chess community and was accused of cheating when she performed well, just because of her race. Now she later talked about this again in December of 2025 in a post on LinkedIn, where she said,
"I'm the only black female chess master in the UK. What comes to your mind when I say that? Very impressive achievement. It's only chess. Why does gender matter? Why does race matter? I've been the only black female chess master in the UK for over 20 years, but no one has ever mentioned it in this country."
After her interview with The Independent, police actually started paying attention to her allegations, though it's unclear whether or not she actually filed a complaint later. But what was clear is, because of Sabrina's courage in speaking out, other female players were inspired. And soon after, 14 of France's top female players published an open letter calling out the sexism and SA they had experienced in the chess world as well.